We usually think of time as like the ultimate equalizer. No matter how much wealth or influence someone accumulates out there, we all operate on the exact same 24-hour cycle.
Right, yeah. We get roughly 80 years, give or take, and then the clock just runs out.
Exactly. It's the one rigid boundary that absolutely nobody can buy their way out of. And that universal ticking clock, it creates this baseline of shared vulnerability, like a constant reminder that we are all fundamentally subject to the same biological reality.
Absolutely. We're all in the same boat, ultimately.
But when you step into the realm of speculative fiction, that clock often just shatters. Suddenly you're looking at a world where the elite don't just hoard the capital and the influence, they hoard the time, literally all of it. And the physiological and psychological fallout of that scenario is genuinely terrifying.
Oh, it completely rewrites the cognitive landscape, and that's exactly what we are getting into today.
Yes. Welcome to today's deep dive. We are using the dark fantasy world of the book Vitae, The Awakening, alongside this incredibly intense research dossier we found on power and immortality.
It's a fascinating pairing, honestly. We're going to use those sources to unpack the actual real-world neurobiology of how extreme power literally degrades the human brain.
Because the villains of this story, the ageless beings known as the Santerrie Council who rule over mortal humans, the Sands, they aren't just your typical mustache-twirling fantasy tropes, right?
Not at all. They operate as this meticulously crafted, historically and scientifically accurate representation of psychological decay.
Which I love. Using a gritty sci-fi and fantasy setting as a Trojan horse to learn real, factual behavioral psychology is exactly the kind of premise we love here. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Where do we start?
Well, before we even touch on the immortality aspect, the endless lifespans of the Santerrie, we really have to establish the baseline of the human brain. Like, what does normal, everyday power actually do to our neurobiology?
That's a great place to start, yeah.
Because if we can understand the baseline corruption of a normal mortal mind, we can understand where the Santerrie Council starts before, time stretches them into monsters.
Right, because there is actually a deeply ingrained neurobiological mechanism behind that old historical saying that power corrupts.
Yeah.
It is not just a metaphor.
Wait, really? It's physical?
It is entirely physical. If we look at some fascinating 2016 research by psychologist Dr. Keltner, we find that achieving a position of dominance physically alters the way the brain processes information.
Alters the processing how, exactly? Are we talking about structural changes or chemical ones?
Both, essentially through neuroplasticity. When a person achieves a really high level of power, their brain shows a marked reduction in the activity of the mirroring system.
A mirroring system. Okay, break that down for me.
So mirror neurons in the prefrontal cortex are basically the foundation of human empathy. They are what allow us to subconsciously simulate the emotions and the experiences of the people around us.
Okay, so if I see someone get hurt, my brain sort of simulates that pain so I can relate to them.
Exactly. But power essentially suppresses that entire network. The capacity to mirror another person's emotional state just diminishes.
Wow. So they literally lose the physical ability to care.
Yeah, and simultaneously, power overactivates the brain's reward circuitry. The dopamine pathways, particularly in the striatum, just go into absolute overdrive.
Oh, wow.
It creates behavioral patterns that closely mirror clinical addiction. It leads to severe impulsivity, risk-taking, and this fundamental rewiring where the brain prioritizes its own chemical rewards over the well-being of the surrounding community.
So power essentially acts as like a set of neurological blinders.
Yeah.
The mirroring system shuts down and your peripheral vision shrinks until the only thing left in focus is your own dopamine hit.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
Everything and everyone else just becomes a blurry obstacle or a tool. And we see this literalized in the baseline world of San Vitae before we even get to the Immortal Council.
Right, with the merchant class.
Yeah, there's this class of wealthy elites, the mortal sands merchants, who possess immense economic power. And they use that power to intentionally addict their subordinates to traditional pharmaceuticals.
It's so dark.
It is. And they do this so they can extract what's called corrupted vitae, which is essentially drawing out their workers' life essence to consume it as a narcotic.
Yeah.
It's a deeply disturbing concept when you read it.
It is disturbing, but psychologically it is completely sound. The extraction of Vitae in the book serves as a literal manifestation of power, hijacking that reward circuitry we just talked about.
Right.
These merchants are utilizing their economic dominance not to build infrastructure or, better their society, but to feed a systemic addiction loop.
They are treating living human beings as disposable metabolic resources for their own euphoric consumption. The power they hold has just turned off those mirroring neurons entirely.
Exactly, it's textbook.
Let me push back on the inevitability of this, though. Is it that the system of power itself is the pathogen, or do naturally corrupt low-empathy people simply seek out power more aggressively?
Ah, the classic chicken or egg debate.
Right. Like, are the Santerrie Council ruthless because they sit on the throne, or do they sit on the throne because they were always ruthless enough to take it in the first place?
It's a great question, but the research actually leans heavily toward the system itself being the catalyst.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Keltner's studies demonstrate that the system of power alters brain chemistry regardless of the individual's initial moral baseline.
No way. So even good people.
Even subjects who score exceptionally high on empathy and egalitarian values before gaining power, they exhibit these exact same neurological shifts once placed in an isolated dominant position.
That is wild.
The brain adapts to its environment. When an individual reaches a tier where they no longer need to rely on others for survival or cooperation, the brain just trims away the neural pathways dedicated to empathy to conserve energy.
Wow, it's just efficiency.
Exactly. It redirects that energy toward maintaining dominance and securing more rewards.
You know, think about how this applies in the corporate world, entirely outside of any fantasy setting. For the listener, just consider the phenomenon of corporate psychopathy. It tracks perfectly with this.
Oh, absolutely. We see it all the time.
We constantly see these high-power executives who display a staggering deficit of empathy, letting aggressive, reward-driven behavior override basic ethical considerations. I mean, they don't have magical powers, but their socioeconomic isolation literally alters how they register the suffering of the people below them.
And that is just mortal power. Now, if we take that neurobiological baseline, that dopamine-fueled empathy deficit, and we stretch it across centuries by introducing immortality, the psychological damage scales exponentially.
Yeah, because if normal, everyday power shuts down your mirroring neurons, centuries of absolute power must leave you entirely disconnected from reality.
It does. And that brings us into the mechanics of hedonic adaptation and desensitization.
Hedonic adaptation. I've heard that term, but what does it mean in this context?
It's the cognitive process by which human beings return to a relatively stable baseline of emotion, despite major positive or negative events. But when we apply this to extreme stimuli, we see a phenomenon known as sensory gating.
Right, okay, I've got an analogy for this. It's like, think about eating your favorite spicy food.
Okay, I'm tracking.
If you eat spicy food every single day, eventually your tolerance builds up. What used to make your eyes water barely registers anymore. So to get that same kick, you have to keep upping the heat until eventually you're covering your food in ghost peppers just to taste a spark of heat. Your brain is gating the sensory input.
That is an excellent mechanical analogy, yes.
Yeah.
Your brain actively downregulates the response. Now, apply that downregulation to the dopamine hits of absolute dominance.
Oh, man.
Over decades, the everyday experiences of ruling, of extreme wealth, of controlling others, they just become mundane. They become the mild hot sauce. The brain filters them out.
So they need the ghost peppers.
Precisely. To activate that reward circuitry, to feel that initial rush of power again, the dominant individual requires increasingly extreme, novel stimuli.
Which means the immortal Santerrie Council aren't just looking for a new sensory experience. They're escalating to profound violence and cruelty just to register a blip on their emotional radar.
Because empathy, at its core, is tied to shared vulnerability. We care about the suffering of others because we subconsciously recognize that we, too, can suffer and die.
Right. We see ourselves in them.
But the Santerries are immortal. They don't fear disease, they don't age, and they are immune to natural death. They have been entirely severed from the human condition.
So mortal lives become completely insignificant flashes in the context of their centuries. They have lost the biological anchor of empathy.
Completely.
This perfectly explains their unimaginably cruel treatment of the protagonist, Kurien, and his Covenness Myasuchi. I mean, when Kurien is captured, the Santerrie locks him in an Inquisitor's vault, trapping him inside an Iron Maiden for 12 continuous years.
It's brutal.
12 years. And they constantly drain him of his pitch-pure Vitae, his uncorrupted, incredibly potent life essence, just to study him and feed off the high. To a normal mind, this is an incomprehensible, horrific atrocity.
But to the Santerrie, it is merely an afternoon's idle experiment. They are numb husks. When Kurien reflects on the horrific torture they inflict, he realizes their cruelty isn't just calculated malice. It is a desperate, flailing attempt to feel something, anything at all.
There was a specific line from Kurien in the book that anchors this entire concept. I wrote it down because it's so good. He says, "What a curse it must be to be ageless. Youth eternal, but no humanity with which to enjoy it." Wait, sorry, no ellipses. Let me reread that without the pause. He says, "What a curse it must be to be ageless, youth eternal, but no humanity with which to enjoy it."
It's a powerful quote. The tragedy of the Santerrie is that they have outlived their own psychological capacity for joy. But, this introduces a secondary problem. Even if the emotional capacity is numbed, highly intelligent beings generally possess a logical moral compass. They understand the difference between right and wrong as an abstract concept.
Right. Cognitive dissonance is a powerful force. Like if you hold the belief that you are a rational, functional leader, but your actions involve keeping a man locked inside an Iron Maiden for over a decade, the psychological friction between those two realities should literally tear your mind apart.
It should, yes.
So how does an entire council of ancient beings justify these atrocities without just succumbing to self-hatred?
They relieve that psychological friction through the mechanisms of moral disengagement.
Moral disengagement.
It's a set of cognitive processes that allow individuals to commit immense harm without triggering self-condemnation or guilt. The brain builds defense mechanisms to protect the ego. The first tactic is dehumanization.
Which we see in history all the time.
All the time. By actively stripping the victim of their human qualities, framing them as lesser, as animals, or as mere resources, the act of harming them no longer violates the abuser's moral code. The Santerrie view both the mortal sans and anomalous beings like Kurien not as people, but as livestock.
Right, because if they aren't people, the rules of human morality simply don't apply to them. It bypasses the cognitive dissonance entirely.
Exactly. Now, the second mechanism is the diffusion of responsibility. Harm committed by a collective entity, like a council or a board of directors, dilutes the guilt.
Because everyone is pointing the finger at someone else.
Right. No single individual feels entirely responsible for the Iron Maiden. They are merely participating in a group decision. But the third, and frankly most insidious mechanism they employ, is moral justification.
Ah, the philosophical trap of utilitarian corruption.
Yes. Utilitarian corruption occurs when authoritarian figures genuinely convince themselves that their cruelty serves a vital, overarching purpose, the greater good.
The classic villain excuse.
Exactly. They reframe their dominance and their horrific methods as absolute necessities for maintaining order. In the lore of Vitae, the world was previously ravaged by a cataclysm that created the wastes.
Oh, right, the history of the world.
The Santerrie Council leverages that history. They convince themselves that without their iron-fisted, brutal rule, the world would descend back into chaotic annihilation.
So they aren't waking up in the morning and deciding to be villains. They wake up believing they are the necessary burden the world requires to survive.
Precisely.
If they have to torture dissidents in a vault to maintain tradition and stability, they view it as the tragic but acceptable price of peace.
And we see identical patterns in real-world history, particularly in ancient aristocracies and authoritarian regimes. When immense power is concentrated within small, long-lived dynasties, the initial goals of governance inevitably devolve into decadence.
Cruelty just becomes normalized.
Normalized and institutionalized, it's constantly excused under the guise of protecting the state or maintaining the natural order.
For the listener, have you ever rationalized a questionable decision at work? Maybe something that unfairly impacted a coworker or a customer by simply shrugging and saying, well, it's company policy.
Oh, that is a great micro example.
We do this constantly. We diffuse our personal responsibility into the system so we don't have to carry the psychological weight of the action. The Santerrie Council is utilizing that exact same cognitive defense mechanism, just scaled up to centuries, with mass suffering and death on the line.
It really serves to highlight the incredible plasticity of the human mind when it comes to protecting its own ego while perpetuating harm.
It's terrifying how adaptable we are to doing awful things.
It is. But, we examine the neurobiological and psychological damage inflicted by the villains, but this leads us into a much broader, arguably more profound question regarding the state of the villains themselves.
Yes, the actual philosophical burden of eternity. Because we treat endless life as the ultimate prize in almost every corner of speculative fiction. The fountain of youth, the elixir of life, the holy grail.
It's the ultimate human fantasy.
But Vitae and the psychological research completely invert that trope.
They do. The critique of immortality relies heavily on the philosophy of existential nihilism and the philosophy of the self. Existentialism, particularly as explored by thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, posits that human beings have no inherent essence. We must construct our own meaning through our actions and choices.
Right.
However, a primary driver of that meaning-making process is the urgency provided by our mortality.
Scarcity.
Exactly that. Without the definitive limit of death, identity loses its shape. Time loses its value. And this leads to a state of profound existential stagnation.
Wow.
If we examine historical, non-theological literature, ancient cultures frequently utilized immortality as a metaphor for stagnation rather than divinity.
Like in the epic myths.
Exactly. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest recorded stories in human history, Gilgamesh's quest for eternal life ultimately ends in the realization that a life without end is devoid of purpose.
I remember reading that.
Similarly, in Greek mythology, the immortal gods are consistently portrayed as petty, desperately bored, and actively envious of the brief, burning meaning found in mortal lives. The immortality of the Santerrie and Vitae adheres directly to this psychological tradition.
Okay, I always try to challenge this concept because on the surface, infinite time just sounds incredible. Like if I suddenly became immortal today, I genuinely believe I would never be bored.
You think so?
I really do. I would learn a dozen different languages. I would master complex instruments like the piano. I would read every book in the archives. I would walk across entire continents. Why does the removal of a deadline inherently mandate nihilism? Why can't an endless life simply be an endless pursuit of self-improvement?
It's a fair pushback, but the answer is because your current motivation to pursue those goals is tethered, largely unconsciously, to the reality of scarcity.
Obviously.
Yes, human psychology and behavioral economics are built entirely around resource limitation. A sunset is striking precisely because it only lasts for a few minutes.
Okay, that's fair.
A personal goal feels meaningful because you only have a finite window of cognitive and physical peak performance to achieve it. Infinite time destroys the scarcity of experience.
So if I have forever to learn the piano,
There is no psychological urgency to practice today, or tomorrow, or even this century. Time discounting, which is the psychological tendency to value immediate rewards over future ones, collapses when the future is infinite. The endless expansion of time slowly erodes the foundational motivation to initiate any action at all.
oh man. When you break down the mechanics of scarcity like that, it's chilling. If you have forever to do something, you lack the psychological trigger to ever actually start.
Exactly. This philosophical lens defines the core tragedy of the Santerrie. Without a terminus to their existence, they suffer from complete identity stagnation.
They're just stuck.
Their choices lose all weight, and their actions carry no real consequence for them. They are frozen in time, unable to evolve, rotting from the inside out due to sheer, unrelenting cognitive boredom.
And it creates such a brilliant narrative contrast with the protagonist. I mean, Kurien is dealing with massive trauma, he's fighting literal and metaphorical inner demons, but his fierce protective devotion to Myasuchi holds profound meaning.
Yes, exactly.
It carries that meaning specifically because he is vulnerable. He is actively willing to sacrifice his finite mortal existence to protect her. His mortality isn't the weakness the Santerrie believe it to be. It is the engine generating the actual value of his life.
Beautifully put. The story utilizes the fantastical elements of Vitae and immortality not as a means to escape reality, but to put a magnifying glass over it. It demonstrates that a life without boundaries is a life without definition.
So what does this all mean when we bring it back to reality? We started this deep dive looking at a dark, post-cataclysmic fantasy world ruled by ageless tyrants. But as we unpack the mechanisms, it's clear that San Vitae operates as a meticulously constructed psychological case study.
Supported by actual behavioral science, yes. It illustrates how absolute power rewires the brain's reward circuitry, suppressing empathy and isolating the individual from the shared human experience.
Right. It breaks down the cognitive dissonance of cruelty, showing how easily the mind can morally disengage through dehumanization and utilitarian justification.
And ultimately, it reframes mortality entirely.
Yeah, that ticking clock we all spend our lives running from isn't a curse. It's the scarcity that creates human connection, urgency, and purpose. Without the looming threat of an end, there is no psychological framework to value the beginning or the middle.
The physical and emotional vulnerabilities we share are the exact mechanisms that connect us. If you surgically remove the vulnerability, you remove the humanity.
Which brings me to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to really chew on after you finish listening. We've established that empathy is intricately bound to shared vulnerability and shared risk. Take a look at our real modern society right now. The wealthiest and most powerful individuals are utilizing massive capital, advanced technology, concierge medicine, and ultra-exclusive geography to become increasingly invulnerable to the struggles, inconveniences, and risks of everyday human life.
They are actively purchasing an engineered insulation from the human condition.
Exactly. As art culture pushes harder and harder for extreme life extension, for radical anti-aging technology, for complete insulation from physical and economic hardship, are we accidentally engineering our own empathy erosion?
That is a very real concern.
By desperately throwing resources at conquering death and discomfort, are we slowly, quietly turning ourselves into our very own Santerrie Council?
It is a profound, deeply unsettling question. And it's one that pulls the dark fiction of San Vitae uncomfortably close to our impending technological reality.
Something to keep you awake tonight. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, the clock is ticking, which is exactly the mechanism that makes your time so incredibly valuable. Now keep questioning the media you consume, the systems of power operating around you, and the future we are building together. We'll catch you next time.